The ship should not have been there. That was the first thing Seth noticed when his long-range scanner lit up with a signal that made no sense. A vessel sitting dead in the debris field just beyond the Thistle asteroid belt, its hull signature belonging to a species that, according to every treaty registered with the Interstellar Accord, had no business being within 40 light minutes of human-occupied space. He'd been out here alone for 11 days, running routine mineral surveys for a contractor who paid badly and asked no questions, and the last thing he needed was a diplomatic incident. Or something worse. But there was a secondary reading beside the ship's dead core, a life sign, faint and stuttering like a candle in a storm. And Seth Calloway had never once in his 34 years of living managed to look away from something that needed him. He docked with the outer hull and cut through the airlock manually, his breath loud inside his helmet, and the smell hit him the moment the seal broke. Copper and something floral and wrong, the way a garden smells after lightning strikes too close. He moved through the dark corridor with his flashlight sweeping the walls, past broken panels and strange markings that spiraled in patterns he couldn't decode, and found her in the engineering bay, half collapsed against a ruptured coolant line that had long since gone cold. She was tall, nearly 2 meters, with skin the color of deep water at dusk, indigo shading into black at her joints and fingertips, and 2 pairs of eyes that were all shut. 4 eyes, he noted distantly. 4 eyes and no weapon in her hands, and a wound in her side that was leaking something luminescent and pale gold, pooling on the floor beneath her like a star had started bleeding. She was Dravali. Seth had never met one in person. Almost nobody had, since the Severance Accord had drawn a hard line between Dravali territory and human space 7 years ago, after the Osara-Phi incident that the newsfeed still argued about. The Dravali were supposed to be cold, methodical, engineered for reason, their whole civilization built on the philosophy that emotion was contamination, that every action should emerge from pure logic and calculation. That's what the briefings said. That's what the history files said. What the briefings had not prepared him for was the way her 4 hands were curled inward against her chest, like she was protecting something, or the way her breathing came in these short, desperate hitches that sounded unmistakably like someone trying very hard not to let themselves cry. He knelt beside her without deciding to. "Hey," he said, his voice low and steady the way you speak to frightened animals and frightened people. "Hey, I've got you. I've got you." Her upper set of eyes opened first, deep amber, shot through with filaments of bioluminescent silver that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. They focused on him with an intensity that wasn't fear and wasn't trust and was something in between, something ancient and raw and calculating even through the pain. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Or rather, sounds came out that his translator collar hadn't finished parsing yet, fragments of Dravali dialect that resolved in his earpiece as syllables without syntax, meaning without grammar. Danger, contamination, leave, do not, the protocol. "I'm not leaving," Seth said simply. "So let's move past that part." He had a medkit rated for 3 alien biologies. Dravali wasn't one of them. He used it anyway. Seth Calloway had grown up in the kind of silence that teaches you to be useful or disappear. His mother Yvonne had worked double shifts at the orbital depot above New Manchester, and the apartment they'd shared was small enough that he'd learned early to solve problems quietly, without asking permission, because asking permission took time, and time was always the thing they didn't have. He'd become a survey pilot because it suited him. Solo contracts, no crew, no politics, just the math of distance and the texture of being alone in something vast. He wasn't unhappy. He'd made his peace with the particular shape of his life. But there was a thing inside him, a mechanism he'd never quite been able to name, that activated in the presence of need the way a compass activates in the presence of north. He didn't question it. He just moved toward it. The Dravali ship, what was left of it, was a class he didn't recognize, smaller than the warships in the historical files, configured more like a research vessel or a courier. It had taken damage from at least 2 directions, which meant she'd been chased, and the communications array had been deliberately destroyed from the inside, which meant she hadn't wanted to be found. 3 of her 4 hands were unbandaged and bore the kind of precise, shallow cuts that came from working with tools in a damaged environment, not from combat. She was a scientist or an engineer, not a soldier. Everything about the ship said she'd been running. His translator collar had finished its calibration by the time he'd bound her wound with everything useful in the medkit, and when she spoke again, the words resolved into something he could hold. "You are contaminating the procedure," she said. Her voice was low and measured, each syllable placed with deliberate care, but beneath the precision, there was a tremor she wasn't controlling. "I had calculated the probability of survival at 11%. You are an uncontrolled variable." "I'm Seth," he said, tearing open a secondary thermal pack and pressing it to her side. What's your name? A long pause. In Dravali culture, Seth would later learn, names were functional designators, not gifts, and offering one to a stranger, especially a human, was considered a form of vulnerability that bordered on the obscene. What she did next cost her something. He could see it in the tightening of the bioluminescent filaments in her eyes. Silly, she said. The name sat in the air between them, and neither of them moved. Something had already shifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Silly had not planned to survive the next 6 hours. This was not despair. She would have been contemptuous of the concept. It was calculation. The ship was beyond repair without a dry dock. The communications array was destroyed by her own hand to prevent the Accord enforcement vessels from tracking her signal. The coolant leak had dropped the temperature in the engineering bay to the edge of her thermal tolerance. She had run the numbers 7 times and arrived at the same conclusion each time, and she had accepted the conclusion the way she had been trained to accept all conclusions, without attachment, without resistance, as simply the next true thing in the sequence. Emotion was contamination. Grief was contamination. Hope was the most dangerous contamination of all, because hope altered the data, introduced desire where there should be only observation. The Dravali had built their civilization on this understanding over 4,000 years of ruthless self-examination. Silly had been raised inside it the way fish are raised inside water. It was not a philosophy she practiced. It was a condition of her existence. And then a human male had crawled through her broken airlock, knelt on the floor beside her bleeding body, and said, "Hey, I've got you," in a voice that contained no calculation whatsoever. She observed this as she observed everything, carefully from a distance, cataloging the data points. He was of average build for his species. His face showed what her xenobiology training identified as moderate concern. He worked on her wound with the focused efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems under pressure, and he did not ask her to explain herself, did not demand to know what she was doing here or what she had done, did not weaponize her helplessness with questions. He simply helped. The simplicity of it was disturbing in a way she lacked vocabulary for. He tried to move her toward his ship twice, and twice she refused, her upper hands gripping the coolant conduit with more force than she had remaining, because leaving the ship meant abandoning the data core, and the data core was the reason she had run in the first place, and the data core was the reason they had hunted her, and she would not let all of it mean nothing. He did not argue. He looked at her for a moment, and then he went to the data core himself, pulled it from its housing with the kind of physical confidence that came from a lifetime of working with his hands, and tucked it under his arm like it was nothing. "Ready now?" he asked. Silly discovered that she had no response prepared for that. She had been running for 9 days, alone, since leaving the Dravali research station on the outer edge of Relthus space. What was on the data core, what she had spent 3 years building, and what had made her a fugitive of her own civilization, was a model. A complex, recursive, predictive model of emotional processing in biological systems that she had developed in secret, in defiance of every institutional and cultural prohibition the Dravali consensus had established. She had begun it as pure science, a dispassionate examination of the neurochemical architecture that produced what other species called feeling. She had told herself it was merely the most complex system she had ever encountered, and therefore the most interesting problem. She had not admitted, even to herself, for a very long time, that she had begun it because she was afraid that the absence of what other species called feeling was not enlightenment but loss, and that somewhere in her civilization's long history of purification, they had cut something out of themselves that was not contamination, but was instead the thing that made everything else worth calculating. The consensus had found her research 3 weeks ago. They had not sent a debate team. If you're enjoying this story so far, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more like this waiting for you. Seth got her onto his ship and into the narrow medical bunk in the aft section, and Silly lay in the yellow light of the ship's modest medbay and watched him move around the small space with the particular economy of motion that people develop when they've been alone for a long time. Every gesture slightly adjusted to accommodate a world scaled for one. He made something hot in a small container and set it beside her without explaining what it was. And when she didn't touch it, he said, "It's not going to hurt you. It's just tea. It's what I've got." Tea. She had read about tea. A dried organic material steeped in heated water, consumed across multiple human cultures with social and calming significance. She picked up the container with her lower hands, careful because her upper hands were still shaking slightly, and she didn't want him to see, and brought it close enough to analyze the scent. It smelled like dried grass and something smoky and something else she didn't have a reference for. She took a small sip. The warmth moved through her in a way that the thermal pack had not, less like temperature and more like... She stopped the thought before it could finish forming, because the word that rose up was the word her research used most, the word the consensus had called her most dangerous heresy, The word she had spent 3 years trying to prove was a real thing and not a disorder. Comfort. You're staring at the tea like it insulted you, Seth said, not looking up from the navigation console where he was plotting them out of the debris field. I am processing it. Fair enough, he said, and that was all. He did not push. He did not explain or elaborate or require her to perform some particular reaction. He simply accepted that she was processing the tea and turned back to his calculations. Silly had interacted with humans before, in formal contexts, across conference tables with treaty documents between them. She had found them, as a species, distressingly imprecise. They communicated in inference and subtext and physical gesture in ways that required exhausting amounts of supplementary interpretation. But she was beginning to understand that what she had categorized as imprecision might be something else, might be a kind of trust, extended in advance, before it had been earned. The way he'd knelt on the floor beside her without knowing her biology, her status, her history, what she'd done, who was after her, whether she was dangerous. The way he'd carried her data core under his arm like it was a simple favor. She made an error then, the first of several. He set a cup down in front of himself and stretched his arms above his head in that particular human gesture of physical release after tension, making a sound she could not categorize. Her translator caller parsed it as non-linguistic vocalization. She observed this for a moment and then said carefully, "Is that a threat display?" Seth turned around and looked at her. Then he made another sound, multiple, staccato, rhythmic, and she realized with a jolt of genuine confusion that it was the thing she had read about, the involuntary convulsive sound humans produced in response to incongruity or amusement. He was laughing. He was laughing, she was certain, in the direction of herself, and she ran her threat assessment and arrived at nothing actionable. And that absence of actionability was itself somehow the source of the laughter, and her processing stalled in a way it had never stalled before. "No," he said, still making the small residual sounds. "No, that was a yawn. I'm tired. It means I'm tired." Humans vocalize fatigue? Sometimes, yeah, involuntarily. He sat down and looked at her with an expression her xenobiology training labeled as warmth, which she had always categorized as a simple radiative metaphor rather than a literal perceptual category, but which she was now beginning to suspect was perceptually real. "Did you think I was going to attack you?" I had not yet ruled it out. "And now?" She considered the data core sitting on his navigation console, the tea cooling in her lower hands, the thermal pack still pressed to her side, the trajectory he had plotted away from the debris field, and away from, she had checked, every shipping lane where accord enforcement would run regular patrols. "Probability reduced," she said. "I'll take it," he said, and turned back to the console. Her emotional armor did not break all at once. It happened the way the light changes at dawn, so gradually that you can't name the moment when it went from dark to something else, only find yourself standing in brightness you didn't decide to step into. It happened over 18 hours, as Seth navigated toward a small independent station he knew on the edge of Thyrix 9 space, talking to her in the unhurried way of someone who is comfortable with silence and therefore doesn't need it broken, but breaks it anyway because she was there and he was curious. He asked her about her research without judgment. He asked not because he was trying to extract intelligence or assess her threat level, but because when she had described what she was working on, hesitantly, watching for the reaction that would confirm she had made another miscalculation, his face had done something she was slowly learning to read, something that pulled the muscles around his eyes and mouth into a configuration that meant he found what she was saying genuinely, personally interesting. He told her, in return, more than she expected. He told her about his mother, Yvonne, working the orbital depot. He told her about the survey contract and how it suited him. He told her, obliquely, without elaborating, but the data was clear, that he understood something about building walls around yourself as protection and discovering too late that the walls kept out everything, including the things worth keeping. He'd had a partner once, before the long contracts. He said it the way people say things they've made peace with but haven't quite set down. She was running her research model against everything he said in real time. Not as analysis, or not only as analysis, as something else. The consensus enforcement ships found them 4 hours from Thyrix 9. 2 vessels, Dravali class, fast and cold and clean, broadcasting on the formal frequency. The data core was consensus property. The researcher designation Silly 7 was a fugitive under Accord Code 9. The human vessel was ordered to stand down and prepare for boarding. Seth read the message twice. He looked at her. She looked at him. "They'll destroy the research," she said. Not a plea, a statement. "I know. Everything the model demonstrates, every proof that what we excised was not contamination but connection, it will cease to exist. I know. Seth turned back to his console and started doing something very fast with his hands. How much of it is in the data core versus in your head? She understood his meaning immediately. A significant portion, perhaps 60%, could be reconstructed from memory. Good enough. He ejected the data core into the debris field. Irretrievable, gone, impossible to pursue, and then opened a broadcast channel to the enforcement vessels on every frequency simultaneously, public, archived, logged across 17 relay stations. And he said, very calmly, that the researcher known as Silly 7 had been found in distress in violation of no accord provision he was aware of, that she was currently under medical observation on his vessel, and that any attempt to board him would constitute an act of aggression against a human civilian, and would be logged as such across every relay between here and the inner systems. He was bluffing, partly. The logs were real. The rest depended on whether the enforcement vessels wanted the diplomatic noise. They held position for 41 seconds. Seth counted aloud, quietly, the way she had watched him do when he was managing tension that he wasn't showing on his face. She'd learned that about him too, the small tells, the way he talked himself through things. And on the 42nd second, the enforcement vessels turned and burned back toward Dravali space without another broadcast, because the data core was gone and the diplomatic noise wasn't worth it. Not today, not yet. The silence afterward was different from all the silences that had preceded it. Silly found that her secondary hands were doing something she had not instructed them to do. They were wrapped around his left forearm, grip firm, the gesture belonging to a Dravali category of contact she had not used since she was very small, since before the conditioning, since a time so early in her life that she had categorized the memories as procedural artifacts and filed them where she would not encounter them. The category was this: something that threatened to leave, and the body's refusal to let it. Seth looked at her hands on his arm. He did not move away. He turned his palm up, slowly, and she understood from his expression that this was an offered parallel gesture, that humans used the hands this way too, and she placed her upper left hand over his, and something in her chest did what she had spent 3 years trying to describe mathematically, what her model called primary bond initialization, what her civilization called contamination, and what she now understood, with the full force of her scientific training and all of the data she'd collected in the last 18 hours, was neither of those things. They sat like that until Thyrix 9 resolved on the view screen, a pale coin of light in the dark. The station was small, noisy, blessedly civilian, full of traders and pilots and the specific entropy of places where too many species converge without enough governance. Silly stood in the docking bay with the station's warm, recycled air moving around her, and Seth standing beside her, and the data core gone, and 60% of everything she'd built still alive inside her mind. And she thought about the consensus, about the long work ahead, about what it would mean to exist outside the framework she had been built inside. She thought about a human saying, "Hey, I've got you," on the floor of a broken ship. "Tuesday," she said. Seth looked at her. "What?" "Your calendar designation. Today is Tuesday according to your ship's log." She paused. "You made me produce the vocalization, the non-linguistic one, on Tuesday." He understood what she meant. The laugh. She'd made a note of the day. "I did," he agreed. "I have no categorical framework for what that signifies," she said. "My model describes the mechanisms. It does not describe what it is like to be inside them." "No," Seth said. "You have to figure that part out yourself." He was smiling. She had a word for that now. Not from the xenobiology texts, but from the last 18 hours of watching his face. She had 47 new data points about the specific geometry of that expression, and each one meant something slightly different, and she intended to spend a very long time cataloging all the variations. She could not prove that the thing she felt was exactly what humans called hope, but she could prove that it altered everything, that it changed the shape of every calculation, that the version of her standing in this docking bay was not the same version that had run the numbers 7 times and arrived at 11%, because that version had been missing a variable that had no official designation in the Dravali scientific literature, and that she was, as of a Tuesday in the Thistle Belt, going to spend the rest of her life naming properly. She let her lower hands brush against his as they walked toward the station entrance, a small thing, barely contact at all, and felt the warmth of it move through her the way tea had moved through her, like temperature and like something more than temperature, like the thing her civilization had spent 4,000 years cutting out of itself and calling progress, the thing that was not contamination, that was never contamination, that was exactly what it had always been. The door opened ahead of them, and the noise of the station rushed in. They walked forward. Thank you so much for watching until the end. That means the world. If this story moved you even a little, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Every week, we bring you new worlds, new characters, and new connections that remind us why stories matter. See you in the next one.